Hey, Robby Gallaty here. I want to welcome you to the third video in our Growing Up Challenge, and hope you're enjoying these videos. We're putting a lot into them because we want to help you in your journey in making disciples. We're walking through the book Growing Up, How to Be a Disciple Who Makes Disciples, and by now you're reading through the book. You should have already read through chapter 1. And today we're going to discuss expectations, outlooks. We're going to discuss what you could challenge your group to do. And I have a special guest with me today, and it's Dave Wiley. Dave Wiley is our Community Outreach Director at our church here in Chattanooga, Brainerd Baptist. And Dave and I had the privilege of spending about 2 years together a couple years ago, and he has gone on to invest his life in guys who are now investing their lives in guys who are now investing their lives in guys. And so, Dave, thank you for joining us this week as we discuss testimonies, as we discuss chapter 1. And Dave has a really neat testimony, similar to mine in a lot of respects. And before we get into that, let me just do some housekeeping, if we will, and just to kind of make sure we're on the same page. Before you begin each week, once again, pray with your group. Break the ice, and we talked about this last week with Tim, but you want to break the ice by asking them, hey, how was your week? What are some struggles you've had this week? What are some victories you've seen this week? And that will get the guys or the girls talking, just kind of prep the group, or prime the pump, if you will. Then you want to go into your scripture memory. So you want to recite last week's verses, which is Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. And then you even want to go back to Matthew 9, which we encourage you to memorize 2 weeks ago. And then you want to recite that with the group. What you hold them accountable to, they will do. So if you let this fall by the wayside early on, then they're not going to memorize it. And you can't expect them to memorize it because you're not holding them accountable to do that. Now, last week we talked about testimonies. And we talked about their testimonies, and you heard from them. Some of them probably shared openly, extensively. Some were very concise with their testimonies. But regardless, that should have got them interested in hearing from one another and should have challenged them and encouraged them as well. I asked Dave to join us today because Dave has not only a pretty amazing testimony, but he has a testimony about discipleship that I think you should hear. And Dave, why don't you share a little bit about your story with us?
All right. Yeah, I won't backtrack too far because my stories are very, very similar to yours. Your story's in the book, and so a lot of drug past, a lot of that mess. But it kind of a little bit of a difference between us was I grew up in the church. I grew up. My father was a pastor, or is a pastor, and I grew up in that environment. I grew up knowing the Word and learning it, and even on some level memorizing it. And I ended up rebelling for a long time. Well over a decade into drugs and alcohol, and that's kind of the story leading up to God breaking me and really just working in my life and bringing me back to a place of repentance and turning my life back over to Him and really surrendering. And so that started a path with me of seeking to know Him better. That went on for probably another near decade, I guess, 6-8 years maybe, and then ran into you. And I remember seeking opportunity. I felt called to ministry. Had been doing ministry, as you know, in a band, and had kind of traveled around the country doing ministry and doing some other stuff and youth ministry, different things. But I ran into you, and I'll never forget our meeting. It was in your office, and I came in to talk to you, and you literally sat back in your chair, put your feet up on the table that we were sitting at, and started bouncing a ball off the wall. And you're like, "So tell me your story," And I thought, "Are you a pastor? What is?" And so I loved it, though. It was beautiful. And you shared your story. I shared mine. Of course, similar backgrounds. And I realized then that what I needed was investment. I thought, I need somebody to pour into me, and I need to learn. I need to grow. And felt like you could do that, so I asked you about it and said, would you mentor me? And you said, well, it's discipleship, and yes. And so we plugged into that, and as you said, for I think it was close to 2 years. And man, that just revolutionized my life. To be able to ask any question that I could possibly think of, and why does the Bible say this, or why does God let this happen, or why do these things go on, to be able to have somebody that I could trust and a group of people that I could trust to do that with was amazing. And then the neat part about it, I guess the best part about it, though, was the fact that at first, as you said, in videos past, you mentioned that you're going to feel like you can't do this. Well, yeah, in the front end you do. But then the beauty is that you get the opportunity to do it. So
that's good.
You begin to invest in others, and it's like suddenly you have this gift that you can give and give. Your life begins to have a great purpose. So for me, discipleship was like you only save one time, but for me, discipleship was like a second salvation. It really was.
Well, and Dave is a perfect model for us to look at because a number of things he said, which were really good, Dave. The first thing he said, which I thought was helpful, was you're in an environment where you can ask questions. I mean, how many people in church have a lot of questions, but they have nowhere to ask them and no one to ask them to? Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, hope they don't ask me because I don't know the answer to these questions, right? But the thing is, this is the greatest phrase I used to say when I was a new believer. I used to, when someone asked me a question I didn't know the answer to, and there were a lot of them, and I would say, you know what, I don't know that, but I'll get back with you. I'll try to find that out. And it's okay to say that. In fact, it's good for people in your group to hear you say that, right? I don't know, but I'll find out. So
or let's find out.
Well, let's find out together.
You would say to us, well, let's find out together. Let's. What do you think?
Yeah.
Let's get in there and see what we can find out.
That's a great thing Tim and I always do when people would ask us questions and they'll say, hey, Pastor, what do you think about Calvinism or Arminianism or speaking in tongues or losing your salvation or anything, eschatology? I would say, well, that's a great question. What do you think about it? And that's good on a number of levels, but anyway, we'll get into that. The second thing Dave said, which I thought was really helpful, was you talked about how you sought this out. So two things about Dave, and it was easy to meet with him. And man, this is a star disciple in the sense of he was open to learn. He humbled himself to learn. I mean, Dave's older than me. This guy has been a believer twice as long as, maybe 3 times as long almost, over twice as I've been a believer. He was raised in a church home. He toured the band in a Christian rock band for years, playing with different guys of various backgrounds, and he humbled himself to learn. And the third factor, and the most important, and it trumps them all, he was teachable, right? That's what you're looking for in disciples. Faithful, obviously available, and teachable. And Dave exemplified that in our group. And so it was so easy to meet with guys like that, and it was a joy to do that. Dave talks about how discipleship was like a second salvation for him, and we know we're only saved once, but it really almost is a rebirth in a sense, because you go through life and you're wanting to grow, you're wanting to learn, but you just don't have an environment to do that, right? And discipleship is an exponential growth hothouse, as Greg Ogden says, for transformation. So you're put in this incubator, this greenhouse, for a season of time, 12 months, 18 months, and you'll never have this back. So remind your group this week, you will never be able to go back to this day to do this again. So let's make the most of this opportunity. This week, they read through my testimony, and I put that in the book because I wanted people to see that, you know, Robby's just like us. I mean, there's no, or maybe Robby's way worse than I was, but if Robby can do this, or God can do this in Robby's life, then man, I can really do that. And that was the reasoning for inserting the testimony right there at the beginning. But we end the chapter with 2 crucial things, and you really need to emphasize this with your group, and I'll let Dave speak to this. But the first one is Jesus' model for making disciples. I mean, Jesus had this 4-fold strategy for making disciples. And then secondly, we end with the difference between an addition strategy and a multiplication strategy. And what I want you to focus on with your group this week is we need to drill into them the importance of discipleship, the mandate to make disciples, the example of Jesus in making disciples, because this will help you and challenge them to replicate the process on the back end. Dave, how did that hit you when you saw that chart that we have in the book between an evangelist or a person going out and leading individually a person to the Lord, or a person implementing this Ephesians 4 model of investing in 2, or like we do 3, and then it exponentially grows. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I could show you, but I won't. But it hit me so well that I printed a little copy of it, and it's in my wallet right now. I carry it with me. So yeah, it really it says a mouthful to see that chart. And you know, thinking about that, and with testimonies, as you know, I do prison ministry, and one of the neat things about discipling somebody and your life playing a role and playing an impact in that is, you know, you invested in me, Tim and others invested in you. You invested in me. I still meet with people on a mentoring level and allow people to continue to invest in me. But when my guys meet with me, they're getting a little of you because of what you invested in me, but they're also getting me in there too, and others that invest in me as I learn and grow. But as I work in these prison ministries, I'll invest in these guys. And what's neat is to see them realize that even though they're behind bars, and for some of them they'll never get out, suddenly their life can have huge meaning because now they themselves are important and of value, and even behind bars their life can have spiritual impact on others, a big one. And so with the multiplication side of things, what's neat is I can invest, for instance, in say 2 or 3 guys in that prison and for a year, and then those guys are going to be in jail maybe for the rest of their life, or at least for many years to come. And they're literally life on life. I mean, they eat, drink, sleep with other men. So if they meet with 2 or 3, and then those guys transfer out to other prisons and other prisons and other prisons in different places, we could have disciples in California in the prison system, for instance, as a result of you investing in me, who invested in a handful of men.
Yeah, and that's so good to close with, because we heard last week how this same discipleship strategy works in a local church. It works in the lives of lay people, works in the lives of any believer in this country or abroad. But this also works in different contexts, difficult contexts, right? And Dave didn't mention this, but he also works in the housing projects in the community. And so from the ground up, whether we're in the church or in the community or in the housing projects or in the prison, we're implementing the strategies in this book, and we're seeing results. It's pretty amazing. Why? Because it's built on biblical principles. And you mentioned one thing I want to close with too, and that is you need to be aware and challenge your members and your group participants. They need to be taking notes. Why?
Yes.
Because they're learning for someone else. I said this in the book. The gospel came to you because it was heading to someone else. How in the world would you ever be able to transfer the information on if you're not taking notes? So you need to be mindful of people in the group, and you need to challenge them. Say, hey, listen, are you teaching this to your children? Are you teaching this to your coworkers? Are you sharing this with your wife or your girlfriend or your husband? Because if you aren't, you should be. And that's one of the things Dave did from the beginning. One of the things I learned is you always need to be taking notes and filing those away.
And let me clarify one thing too. I know you're closing, but let me clarify one thing too. That even as I said, it looks like you and it looks like me. Prayerfully, it looks like Christ above all. I just want to clarify that Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So prayerfully, that's the goal, is that it looks like Christ.
Absolutely. Great way to end. Next week, your group is memorizing Matthew 28, 19, and 20. Great verses that really will support what we've talked about here, and it's a great section of verses to memorize, to share. I can't tell you how many times I've shared those verses with people and with family members and relatives. Encourage your men to do that. Chapter 2, encourage your women to do that. Chapter 2 will be next week, so we're going to dive in more to the discipleship system and the strategy. And again, you can do this. We're praying for you. Our team here, our Replicate team, is praying for you. Look forward to seeing you next week. Leave us a comment. Scroll down. Leave us a comment. We want to hear from you, and we'll try to get on and answer some of those as well. God bless you. Look forward to seeing you next week.